Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Into the Terminal. Today, we're going to be talking about transferring data via network and whatnots.
How to move your stuff around.
That's right. So why don't we just jump on into the terminal and we'll talk about our first technology, which is rsync.
It's a great idea.
All right, so rsync is a remote copy, but you can use it locally. So here I've got a directory called my files, and you can use rsync to take the my files, and we're going to use -a. I'll talk about that option in a second. And you can move it locally on your system too, right? Like I can go home RHEL. And it'll copy the files from the source location to the destination location. So now if I look at home RHEL, right, there's the stuff. All right, so, but the real magic with rsync is remote copies. So if instead of rsyncing my files to home RHEL, I instead rsync them to client. So you give it a machine name, and then you can optionally provide an additional directory, like where you want it to be on the box. Alternatively, if you don't tell it any directory location, it'll go into the home directory of the user you're authenticating to with that box. So actually, let's put it in temp just for funsies. So I can switch over to client here and look in temp, right? And there's the my files directory. And if I look at my files in temp, there's the files. So at this point, you're asking yourself, why would I use this over something like SCP or SFTP? And the real magic of rsync is once you've made your initial copy, when you make additional copies, it uses an algorithm that only transfers the deltas or the changes between the local and the remote. So I can go into a file here on my system. Oops, my files. And I can add some stuff. Right, so now I have a local change, and I can use rsync to synchronize any changes that may have happened locally with the copy that I'm maintaining over on the client machine. And I'm going to add in stats option, because you may have noticed that when I ran it initially, it silently copied all the files over, but I was given no information. So with stats, it gives me some breakdown of what's actually being transferred between the two machines. And so here you see the total file size. That's for all the files in the directory. That's how much space they take up. However, the transferred file size when we made this synchronization was only 185 bytes because it was just the stuff that I changed in the file contents. Right, so if I go back over here to RHEL client and I do a cat on temp, my files, yum repo or yum.conf, right, there's the new updated content that I transferred over to it. So that's the power of rsync.
There's also a verbose flag, which will show you every file that gets moved over, which is sometimes handy.
Yep. And I actually looked at that, but what I didn't like about verbose, here, I'll show you right now. It's very chatty. Well, it's not so much that it's chatty. So you get the sent and received bytes. So it still kind of tells you that it's only incrementally transferring stuff.
Right.
But I found this a little bit confusing because it's not transferring a total size, right? That's the total size of what could be in there. Where I found --stats broke it out a little bit more granularly for me to better understand.
Different use case. Verbose would tell you all the things that it copied if you care about that. Stats gives you the statistics on what copied, right?
Right. The other thing I like about the stats is it gives me a breakdown here of the files that are being created and deleted by number. And so here, when we did the transfer, only one file was transferred, the one that I had made a change to, not the whole set of files that I'm maintaining with this rsync. One last thing I wanted to show you about rsync before we transition is removing things with rsync. So if I was to delete a file and then do my rsync again, when I go over to the client system, you can see that that file is still present, which is kind of weird because you think if you're rsyncing and you're trying to keep these two directory structures in sync, that when I change one, it should automatically change the other. But rsync, in an attempt to be really conservative about losing data, won't actually delete things on the synchronized directory unless you explicitly tell it. So if you're interested in removing anything, we're going to do the same rsync, but I'm going to add on -- delete. And now you can tell that that happened because it told me, hey, I deleted this file. And sure enough, if we go over to the client, oops, and we look at the right directory.
That helps.
Right down here is where that yum.conf file is. It's no longer there because it was deleted.
Right.
So yeah, that's a little bit on rsync. The nice thing is that it only transfers the changes. So you don't transfer all the files every time like you would with some of the other file transfer bits that we're going to talk about. So it's a little bit more conservative on how much of your network bandwidth it consumes.
So there's your crash course on rsync.
Yep. So today's episode is brought to you by our new sponsor. For $1 million, you can get in real life IRL save icons. That's right. And they come even in your favorite distribution colors, right? Nate's got his favorite blue fedora color.
Yeah, it's important.
I'm big on Red Hat Red, 100%.
Yeah.
Right? We got, I don't know, mint maybe? And then the orange one. We, of course, have the orange one. So there you go. IRL save icons, yours today. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming. Don't forget to drop that like and subscribe.
I cringed a little bit when I heard that floppy hit the floor. Just a little.
They're made of hard plastic. It's fine. Right? It's okay, Nate, I'm going to freak you out. You ready?
Don't touch it.
I'm touching it. I'm touching it.
Oh, my, no. Yep. It's not that kind of show, Scott.
I look.
The depravity.
Good. The data tastes good. That's all I can say.
Ay.
So in our deeper dive today, we're going to be covering a couple other technologies for transferring files. Nate, you're going to be talking to us about two really common ones, especially for things like network storage arrays. Specifically, we're going to be talking about SMB and NFS.
Yep.
And we'll do some basic setup for SMB and NFS shares and some client stuff on how to access them. So yeah.
We will.
And we have a couple of options to talk about for rsync as well, because I forgot to do that. We had talked about it.
You want to cover those first? I can bring your terminal back up.
Yeah, let's do that.
Since we're
all right. So when we're setting up for the episode,
in our mind, right?
When we were setting up for the episode, Nate was like, "Oh, and you have to use this option to make sure that you keep the SE Linux context intact. Oh, and you need this option to make sure that the permissions stay intact." And I said, "No, because when I did the rsync, I used -A, which is the archive option, and it does all of that stuff. So it preserves the permissions and ownerships from the local repository of data to the remote repository data." So we could do things like, well, let me make some changes.
I'll say that judging from Shantanu's comments in the chat, their default rsync flags include A and Z, just like mine do. So I feel like you need to prove yourself here, Scott.
Well, let's try that, and then
maybe it's just old muscle memory and the Z is not required anymore, but I swear it used to be.
What is it? Man.
What are you trying to remember?
Chicon. All right. Oops. Dash G. I think that's right. Oh, HTTP sys content. No, still no. Man, host-z.
Totally not remembering your syntax here. Here, I have.
Right, this is what happens when you.
I have a context in the notes for when I do NFS, or not NFS, Samba later. If you look for my SE manage, there's a Samba share T. Use that one. Samba _share _T.
No, I got it. I just looked at my web directory and got it.
Okay.
Over there. All right. So let's just make sure that it's there. Right. Cool. All right. So if -A works as I think it does, when I rsync again. There you go. Some file attributes were not transferred. Let's see if we add in a Z.
I forget if it's uppercase or lowercase. Shantanu seems to be suggesting that it's lowercase z. Thought it was uppercase z.
Nope. Let's try uppercase Z. Nope. So why don't we come back? I'll look at it while you're doing some of your demos and we'll figure out how to actually get that over there. But while I'm here, let's see.
It's pseudo all over again.
Yeah, I know. This is what happens when we do live demos. That's why we don't do them. All right. So, and it failed to copy the thing. So it looks like it didn't copy any of the things because it also didn't preserve my other file that I wanted to copy over. All right, so let me figure out how to do the Z, the SE Linux context to make sure that those get copied, and then we'll try one more towards the end of the show.
Shantanu says Z is compression, so maybe I'm steering you wrong. And I thought Z was the SE Linux one. Maybe it's one of the other flags, capital A perhaps. I don't know. Go look at the man page, Scott.
I will, but not like while everybody else is watching me look at man pages. They can watch other things while I am doing research on the fly for my not very well planned out demo.
So much fun to watch Scott look at man pages. All right, should we move on to Samba while you look at man pages? All right, get my terminal up here. All right, so a short story. When I worked at the college, we had Novell file shares, right? Like old school eDirectory Novell. It was like a nightmare. And anyone who ever managed Novell in its later days will probably agree with me. But we were trying to get off of Novell, so we thought, well, what's a great open source solution? And we decided on Samba. We actually did like an emulated NT domain, and we did Samba shares and everything. So I have done entirely too much on Samba, but you know what? Half of it I've forgotten over the years because I haven't done it in a long time. So I had to actually look up some of this stuff while I was getting ready for today. So first of all, Samba, if people aren't aware, Samba is a collection of tools that will allow you to make Samba or CIFS shares. And if you come from a Windows background, that's basically the native Windows file sharing. If you share a folder on Windows or from an Active Directory domain, there's a good chance that's going to be a CIFS share, CIFS. I forget, Common Internet File Service, I think is what that stands for. But anyway, What Samba does is it lets you make those shares from a Linux machine, right? It's started out as a very small project, and it's expanded to the point where you can make an entire Windows domain in Samba, which is actually pretty cool. But the package you need is just called Samba. Okay, and it's going to install some additional dependencies. There's things in here for like managing your user directory. You can link this backended to like LDAP or other directory backends to get your user database. I'm going to make a very simplistic share. And I think we should probably note that a lot of the other examples we're using today are also very simplistic. When we get to NFS, there's also some more advanced things for NFS that can make it more secure and make it easier to manage permissions. We're not going to touch on that today because it just gets too deep too quickly. Same thing for Samba. We could do like crazy directory backends and whatnot, but I'm just going to make a public share for now to kind of show you how it works. So now that I've created now that I've installed the packages, of course, there's a service we have to enable. And it's just called SMB. And that comes from the old naming convention of server message block. If anyone's curious why it says SMB. And the name Samba comes because literally they took the letters SMB and they're like, what can we call this that's not just 3 letters? And they found the word Samba and thought it was perfect. So there we go. All right. So once you have the service enabled, now you need to actually configure a share, and it'll come with some shares out of the box. Like it can do things like share user home directories. So the user you authenticate as, you'll be able to access your home directory over Samba, which is kind of cool if you're hosting like a file share for either like a business or even just for home, right? It could be useful to have your own little home directory set up for that. So let me clear the screen so it's easy to see here. But we're going to look at the Samba config. And that's just etsy samba smb.conf. And inside of here, this is where you're going to see the default configurations, right? You can specify an old school work group, just like you would on a Windows network. You can set up printing through cups, which is kind of neat. Here's that definition for home directories. See, it says homes. And it lets you specify things like who can access these things and whether they're writable or browsable or not. You can share printers across Samba, which is kind of cool. I thought that was kind of nice when we were doing it. And you can do hidden shares the same way you do on Windows, where you add a $sign to the end of it, and then it doesn't show up when you browse, but you can still access it by hitting the $sign at the end of that share name. So that'll still be respected. But what we're going to do is we're going to add another share at the end here. And let me see if I can copy paste this out of my doc, or if it's going to grab all this weird formatting. It copy pasted pretty clean, it looks like. Okay, so this block here at the top, that's the name of the share, what it's going to show up as when you browse. You can add a comment to it so that when you hover over it in a GUI, it'll tell you what the comment is, or if you do a listing of shares, it'll tell you what that comment says. The path on your local file system where it's supposed to be sharing the files from, which I have not created yet, you'll notice, so I'm going to have to do that then. Whether it's browsable and whether it's writable. Now, this is generalized permissions. You can then also layer POSIX file permissions on the local file system, right? So you can get a little more granular than just yes or no that you see inside of the configuration file here. And public says, do I show this to all users that have access to this system, or do I only show it to people who've authenticated? And if so, what people are they, right? You can make a list of groups or a list of users in there, and you can have it only accessible to those people. So again, you can get pretty granular with how these shares are configured and how permissions are set. So let's save this out.
And Nate, 1 second. So in Windows terms, browsable says, is this a hidden share or not?
Right.
Right. So when somebody accesses the machine, do they see this folder available to them? And then the opposite of public would be a user list, or there are a couple of options for how you want to control access. And
yeah, the best example that's in the file here already is the home directory one here. You see it says valid users. And it always bothered me that there was a space in here. It just doesn't feel right, but that's the way it works. So you can see valid users, and this is using a variable. This is whoever connected is this %S. They have access to this folder because this folder is their home directory, right? If you were specifying a specific directory, you would put in the valid users there. And this would have to be users that are known to Samba, right? You can configure things so that Samba has its own user database that is completely separate from the POSIX users on the system, right? So that can get confusing sometimes, which is another reason I'm not going into users today.
Yeah. And then you can see down, you were talking about writable. So you mentioned that you could control writing using the standard Linux file system permissions, but you can also see there in print, there's a write list, and those are the users that are permitted to write regardless of what the, well, in addition to the file permissions on the file system. So it could be writable for people on the file system permissions, but if they're not in the write list, Samba won't let their client make writing changes to it, even if the Linux file system permissions were allowed. So, so there's a bunch of different ways that you can implement your security and access controls using this. The Linux way, the Windows way, a mix of the Linux and Windows way. So
when we implemented this at the college, we had a guy working for us, older guy who he knew all of the secrets. He knew all, like, he was the guy, right? He had made us this whole series of, I forget if they were Perl or Python. I think they were Perl at the time. The whole series of Perl scripts that would do things like query LDAP and make sure these users have these perfect permissions and whatnot. And then there was a database piece that we basically managed the database to say these users had access to these shares, and then his scripts would make that all happen on the file system. It was crazy the way he had written this up, and the way it worked and operated. I mean, it was an impressive piece of work. I still have we had bought, all of us, copies of O'Reilly's Running Samba book so that we could all learn Samba well enough to, like, do this. And I had his copy when he retired, and I referred to it as the Half-Blood Prince edition because he had so many notes scribbled all over it and dog-eared pages. And I'm like, we are never losing this book. Except when I left the college. Now it's on my bookshelf.
Oh, you took the Half-Blood Prince edition.
We moved off of Samba by the time I left, so it's okay. I kept it for memory's sake. Okay, anyway, back on topic. People come here for the stories as well as the tech, right? All right, so I made the share in the Samba configuration file, but I mentioned earlier I hadn't made the directory yet, so let's make the directory.
Oh, look at you using the SRV directory, man.
Yeah. Well, it could be because the thing that refreshed my memory on how to make this also use the serve directory, and I'm like, that's a good idea. I'm going to put it there. Okay, and then we have SE Linux to think about, and this is definitely important if you have SE Linux enabled on your system. So I'm going to copy paste this because it's a lot to type. Oh, I missed a quote. Maybe I'm going to blame Google for that one.
Oh no, it made your double quotes the wrong way.
Okay, and then we're going to do a restore con. Oop. Okay, and now I should be able to restart Samba. And it should have a share now. Now, of course, at this point, we could browse to this from anything that supports CIFS, but the only thing I have in my lab environment is another RHEL machine. So, of course, I'm going to show you how to do this on a RHEL machine. On RHEL, there's client tools that comes along with the same Samba package that the server tool, or no, it's actually a separate, I'm thinking of NFS now because I know that's my next demo. There's a separate client package. There's a thing called Samba-Client, which gives you all of the Samba client tools. So let's install that. Nope. Okay, and again, it's going to install some dependencies and whatnot. And the tool, it comes along with a number of, like, CIFS and SMB compatible tools that you can use to do different things. But the thing I'm going to show you now is just SMB client. There's also, you can mount these shares, right? So there's actually I forget if it's in the client tools or if there's a separate package, but you can actually do a mount.cifs and mount one of these Samba shares as a local directory on your RHEL or other Linux systems. But I'm going to use SMB client, which is an interactive client tool. So let's just do SMB client -L tells us, show me all the shares I have access to on the target. And you actually use the same notation that you would on a Windows machine, except you use forward slashes instead of backslashes, which I think no, that is correct. Forward slashes.
That is correct.
On Windows as well, right? I remember everybody would always get confused on that when they were using it on Linux, because backslashes do different things in Bash than forward slashes do. Okay, so the name of my server is RHEL because of the way the lab environment is set up. And this should it's going to ask me to authenticate, but remember, I made the share public and I didn't set up any Samba users, and I'm not messing with that. So I'm just going to hit enter, and it's going to show me anything that I can access without any authentication. And you can see right there is my share 1, and also the printers that we told it to show. And there's an IPC share, which is like a administrative thing that happens within Samba, which I probably should have looked more into before saying that. I forget exactly what it's for, but it's a system share that comes with, there wasn't a share defined in the Samba config, if you remember, called IPC, but that's a built-in thing. And then we can actually connect to share 1 using the same SMB client. Let me make sure I have I need a file to show you how this works. So I made a directory instead of a file. There we go. Okay, now if we just use SMB client and specify a path we want to connect to, be rel/share1. This should
spell it correctly.
I spell SMB client correctly. Okay, and then again, it's going to ask us to authenticate, but again, didn't set up any users, so it's a public share. And now this works very similar to an interactive FTP session, right? Or SFTP session. Where you can do file lists and you can do gets and puts to get files and put files. So I'm going to do a put on my file, and as long as I got access denied. I must have done something wrong in the permissions on the server side.
Well, what's your file permissions on the target directory?
Yeah, well, remember, I'm root.
But you're not root.
True.
You're an anonymous user.
That is right. I need to do the thing we tell people never to do.
Oh, no.
It's public. It's a public share. This is intentional, Scott. Okay. So you're right. That's the step that I missed. And now it should work. Oh, only if I click in the window properly. There we go. Now I put the file.
Yeah,
okay, and now we can see my file.
If you do an ls back over on your other machine, a long listing, you should see the owner that you're operating as that's not root. I think it's nobody.
Could be.
But it's been a minute.
Nobody. There you go. So there we go. We have a Samba share, and we can get and put files to it and whatnot. And again, like I said, you can go a lot deeper on making this better, more secure, and setting up authentication per user, but kind of outside of the scope of today's demonstration. All right. Anything else we should cover on Samba before I move along?
Just that, like, Samba implementations are really common, especially in things like storage arrays. So, like, you can get them set up. In fact, most storage arrays actually run Linux behind the scenes. So when you're going through the web UI for your storage array and you're adding a Windows share, it's probably using Samba for establishing that Windows share. So you can use SMB client to attach to it just like you could a Windows machine.
I might wager that more SMB shares are shared on Linux than they are on Windows. If you think about NAS devices and Mac OS. Well, I think Mac OS made their own implementation, but they used to literally run Samba.
Yeah. So earlier you had mentioned SMB mount. SMB mount is part of the client utilities.
There we go.
And you can just list the Samba resource in your CIFS tab.
Yep.
And then it'll just be mounted into your directory structure when your system boots, when all the network file systems are attached to your system.
And the cool thing is, as long as you can keep track of the permissions, you could share that same directory structure using other protocols from your Linux machine, right? So you could share it, you could SCP back and forth, you could rsync data into it, you could connect to it via NFS as well as SMB. It's really flexible that way.
Yeah, and I would caution folks, Nate showed you the unauthenticated way, and
yes, very simple example.
Yeah, but it uses this like non-privileged user account called nobody, and NFS will do something similar, which means that other people connecting non-authenticated are also operating as that person. So the nobody user owns that file, and other people who connect as the nobody user also then inherit all the content that the nobody user has access to. So it's fine if you don't care. Maybe you're home labbing and like it's for you and your family, and that's fine. Right. But in a like more businessy business type setting, you absolutely care. And that's where something like AD integration is really handy, because then like you're doing all the user management stuff through your existing shared user infrastructure, and Samba will like be able to manage that and use it as long as your Linux box knows about it and can use it.
Right. And it can link up with a Kerberos domain. It can use LDAP as a backend. There's probably a bunch of others that I'm not even considering. But those are the ones I've personally got experience with that I've seen work on Samba. But there's a bunch of options for user backends and for permissions. If you were to join your RHEL systems to, say, an IDM domain and then link up your Samba authentication to IDM, then all your users would then be unanimous across both your file system and your CIFS or SMB implementation, which is really the way it should be, right? That's kind of what Active Directory gets you for Windows.
Yeah. So you want to show us some NFS-y things?
Yeah. So the next demo we've got is NFS, which I've already kind of alluded to. So let's make another directory. Again, inside a serve. We'll just call it NFS because we're being really creative today. And then the client and server tools are included in a package called NFS-utils. And there used to be like 3 services you had to have running to make NFS work, and that's not necessarily the case anymore as long as you're using the modern protocols. It was like an RPC service you had to run and a bunch of others. And that is a lot simpler now. All you really have to do is enable the service called NFS-server. So let's do.
So Nate, I have some history behind that if you're interested.
Feel free.
So NFS came to us from Sun Microsystems, and there were a whole bunch of services that they would offer. And one of the other ones was called NIS. So there was NFS, your network file system, and NIS, your network information system, which did like users. And both of them sat on top of a compatibility layer, like infrastructure layer called RPC. Remote procedure call, I think, was what that stood for. Yeah. And so that's why you had to have like the RPC services managed and the NFS services, because in the olden Linux or olden Unix days, RPC was kind of like the baseline infrastructure API stuff. And then on top of that, you ran NFS or NIS or both.
Right.
And over the years, NIS is no longer a thing. And so then we just had NFS and RPC separately, which didn't really make sense to keep them both separate. Right. So they got merged together.
Yep. Yeah, it used to be you didn't learn NFS unless you also learned NIS, as I understood it, because the two worked so closely hand in hand that you kind of, I wouldn't say couldn't, but it didn't make sense to have one without the other. And I've never worked in a situation where I had to run NIS. We always had a different identity backend that did not require NIS. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, NIS was one of the original shared identity backends,
Right.
right? This is before LDAP.
Right.
And it was specifically because of some of the things that NFS does, like how it manages file ownership. So that you could have the same user accounts defined across your organization. That way, if a person owned a thing, they own that thing on every box because they have the
Yes.
same credentials on every box.
And
And
you'll see
so,
once I work through setting this up, how easily permissions could get out of whack if you don't share identity, right, between all your machines, and then you start mounting NFS shares on several clients because your identity may not match up from one client to the next unless you're either lucky or intentional.
right. And so this has now been replaced by LDAP, AD,
Right.
IPA, or Identity Manager. So yeah, Nate's going to show you some problems. Realize that there are already existing solutions. You just have to implement them.
Right. Okay, so to define a share in NFS, or a file system that should be exported, there's a file inside of Etsy called exports. So literally Etsy exports, flat text file, line by line. You define what shares you want to share, and the authorization is performed by client IP address, right? Which is kind of a weird way to do things, but it is what it is. This is how this works. Now, Scott, you and I were talking when we were planning the episode that there are ways to leverage Kerberos, right? To manage authorization instead of is that instead of IP address authorization, or is it in addition to?
So Kerberos is really for implementing the network encryption for when you're actually transferring
Okay.
files between systems. And so there's a bunch of different ways that you could do that. You could do it through host-based keys. So between two hosts, there is encryption. You could do it user-based keys. So when a user interacts, they encrypt stuff with their user principals instead of their host or service principals. But the Kerberos stuff is mostly for encryption of the data across the network. That's also something that in your Samba example, we didn't outline, I don't think. And
Right.
here with like the really simple, this is like version 3 NFS, really simple.
Right.
Everything is happening across the network in plain text, which is probably not what you want. And so both services also have implementations of encryption so that you can transfer files encrypted between systems. But that adds a whole layer of complexity that we didn't want to get into in the next like 10 minutes.
Right. We're already 12:40. So this is what a very basic line in the Etsy exports might look like. I've told it what path I want to share out, and I've told it what client IP address can connect to it, and the RW says this is read and write. You can do read only. I think it's just RO. There's also additional options that you can pass in through there, and I'll show you one in a minute because I'm intentionally doing something incorrectly here to show you one of the things that could catch you, and if you're not aware of it, could bite you later. So you can also specify these IP addresses using CIDR notation, right? So I could do like 10.5.1.0/24, and then that would say anything in the 10.5.0 network is allowed to access this share read write, right? But I don't want to do that because we're on a cloud provider here, and I have no idea who else is on the network next to me. So we're going to put in an explicit IP address instead. Okay, and then once that's excuse me, once the exports file is defined, the NFS server does not automatically read that. And for a long time, what you had to do was restart the NFS service. But for an equally long time, I think at this point, there's a way to use the export FS tool to just tell it, go ahead and re-export all the things inside of the Etsy exports file. And that is just export fs-a, says everything in the export fs file or Etsy exports file, re-export it through NFS, right? And then what that'll do is it'll refresh that listing and the permissions or access list, I suppose, for NFS. And now at this point, we should be able to mount this from our client side. So if I did, first of all, let's clear out the IP address here. Now, if we do a mount -t NFS, And we're going to specify rel:/, and this is literally the file system path on the host that you're mounting from. You do serve/NFS, and we're going to just mount it in /MNT because it's convenient. Oh, I didn't put the client tools on this one. That's what'll happen if you try to mount it without installing the client tools. That I totally did that on purpose to give you an example. And this actually installs a helper for mount so that it knows how to talk to NFS. That's why you need these client tools first, or the tools in general. Okay, now we can mount. Okay, and just like you'd expect mount, if there's no error, it returns nothing. And if I look in /mount now, it's empty because it's also empty on the server over here. Okay, so now this is a directory we've mounted. We should be able to just go in there, right? And put in a file. And I get permission denied, but I'm root. Why am I permission denied? I'm root on both sides of this equation. I made it as root. I told it as read write, and I connected to it as root. So why can't I write to the share? Well, that's because NFS is smart enough to know that root on different systems may not be the same person, right? So I might own this server. Scott might own the server next to me. We're both root, right? And because it shares those identities by ID, right? Root is always UID 0 unless you've done some hacky crap to change it. We can't trust that root is always an administrator that we can trust. So by default, NFS squashes it, they call it. So there's a mount option, or I should say an exports option, that just says, you know what, I'm not worried about that. And again, this is not something you're going to want to put into production in like an enterprise deployment. You shouldn't be doing this stuff as root as in an enterprise deployment. But in my case, this is a very simple lab example, and you should know that this exists. No root squash. Okay. So if you're working in your own lab and you're like, why can't I access these things as root? That's why it's by default saying, no, you can't do this stuff as root. Okay, and then because we made a change, we need to run that export FS again. And now if I go back over here, I think I have to remount. So okay, and then that just says, sort of refresh the mount. Now if I touch my file, it should work. There we go. Now if I went back over here and looked in serve NFS, there's my test file. So there we go. NFS is another great way to move data around. And in that example from earlier where you were doing rsync, it reminded me when we were moving from Novell over to Samba, we had this interim period where we had to get all the data off of Novell and get it onto Samba. And we're talking terabytes and terabytes of data, right? So we had actually cooked up these intermediary systems that actually ran on CentOS, because CentOS could both mount Novell shares and Samba shares, right? So then we cooked up all these scripts in the middle that would use rsync to mount both shares, sync the data from one to the other, and then keep it up to date so that in the interim process, while we were actually moving everybody over to Samba, they didn't lose data when they moved from Novell to Samba. So another great, sort of use case for all these tools on a common operating system like Linux. And without it, I don't think we could have done that, because you can't like mount a NFS share from Windows, for example. I guess you can. It's not as convenient. Okay. So we had some examples for SCP and SFTP that I don't think are going to take too long. Should we dive into those?
Well, I wonder if I could just tie off on rsync.
Sure.
Because I actually did some research and figured that one out.
Let me switch the shares back here.
So what you need to pull the SE Linux permissions or SE Linux attributes is the capital X option.
It's like extended
attributes.
Yes.
Exactly.
We were
right.
close.
So
X is so close to Z in the alphabet.
over here. Let's do an LZ. Right, so we could see that it did preserve the SE Linux context with that X attribute. And then also earlier I had done a different user owner right there on the spooler file. So it transferred both of those and preserved both those. So the A option, the archive option, preserved the user attributes. The capital X option did the extended file attributes like SE Linux context. I think it would also do file system ACLs and preserve those too if you were copying those. But yeah, so that's it. Capital X.
Capital X instead of Z. We were close. We were close.
So what happens when we do demos live with not prior testing?
We even talked about it before, and we're like, we can do that live. Yeah. All right. So the other two I had were SCP and SFTP. SFTP works very similar to that SMB client we used before, except it runs it over an encrypted channel, right? And it's actually leveraging the OpenSSH daemon, if I remember correctly, to get that encrypted channel up and running. And SCP used to be a different protocol that ran over OpenSSH. Now it actually backends through SFTP as well. It's just the command line works differently. And it's just a really convenient way that you need to move a couple of files from one to the other. You can just use SCP and it'll move it in this encrypted way. It'll still use your SSH key exchange the same way you would with SSH. And if you have those key exchanges set up, you can even use tab auto completion between two systems that support it, which I think is really nice. Yeah, I don't know if we need to go to delving into demos for SCP and SFTP, but if people are that interested, we can add them to another episode in the future.
Maybe. Also, the other thing that uses SSH protocol is rsync. So at early in rsync's days, it was part of the RTools, which was RSH, rsync, rlogin, and RCP, which all used an unencrypted network transit. Most of the other RTools are forbidden now, so nobody likes them, like nobody likes Telnet.
Remember the days that you would Telnet into a Linux server.
Yeah. But rsync has automatically been updated, so it uses the SSH suite behind the scenes. So when I was doing all those copies between boxes, it was using the SSH infrastructure for actually encrypting that network traffic between the two boxes.
Those were such interesting times when we connected to our machines over unencrypted channels.
I mean, it was only really more interesting when you did so across the internet.
Yeah. Well, this was like the era where I was learning things, right? So I would be like in my tech support job at work, and I'd be like, I really want to be able to get to my server that I run at home because I've been working on this thing, and I really want to get in and keep working on it in between calls and whatever. So you'd open up Telnet, not knowing any better, right? And then somebody sniffs the traffic across the completely open cable network, which is also not a thing anymore, right? That traffic is all by default encapsulated and encrypted. And then all of a sudden your Linux server would get nuked and you'd be like, what happened? I didn't do anything. And then you find out you have a learning experience.
Whoa.
It was such crazy times.
All right. So next week, I don't know what we're doing yet, Nate. We have some ideas.
Something in the terminal.
Yeah, we definitely have some ideas in our show planning. I'll have to go and find another sponsor again.
I know.
Man, we don't have any repeat sponsors. We should fix that.
Well, they sponsor us for one show, and then they realize that was a mistake, and they leave.
Must be it.
I think it's all that extra money you're skimming off the top, Scott.
Well, I mean, a manager's got a manager. If you've made it this far, thanks for watching to the end. Don't forget to mash that like and subscribe button. And Nate, I did want to talk about one thing. We started getting comments on our videos, which are like really nice. And as like an older guy, I don't know what to do with these compliments.
We got compliments on the internet?
I know. It's shocking. And then,
happen.
But if you like the show, tell your friends. Like that's the best thing is more people help share the knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Nice things on the internet, man. This does not compute, Scott.
All right. So next week we will do another Into the Terminal. We're actually going to skip the week after that because we have in real life meetings that we're going to be going to. So like Nate and I will physically be in proximity to one another.
Well, not on Friday. Yeah. On Friday, we will likely both be traveling home. Also inconducive to making shows.
Yes. And that's why we're going to skip that show in 2 weeks on Friday. Right. But then we'll be back after that. Yeah. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next week for another Into the Terminal.
Everybody have a great one.